Liam's world was defined by symmetry and precision. His days began at 6 sharp, marked by the soft hum of his coffee machine brewing exactly 12 ounces of espresso, and his nights ended with the muted sound of pages turning in his meticulously curated design journals. As an architect, Liam thrived on the satisfaction of clean lines, balanced layouts, and spaces that obeyed his will. His apartment, with its muted tones and minimalist decor, mirrored the order he demanded from life. Everything had a place, and everything stayed there. The call came at 11:48 p.m., a jarring interruption that sent a cold spike of dread down his spine. Late-night calls were never good news. He hesitated, staring at the screen with his sister's name flashing on it, before realizing it wasn't her number but a stranger's voice that answered. It was from a hospital, the words sharp and mechanical, piercing through the quiet of his apartment. A car accident. His sister, Margaret, and her husband, Andrew, hadn't survived. There was a pause, as if the caller were bracing themselves, before they added that Margaret and Andrew's daughter, Violet, was now in his care. Liam couldn't speak at first, the weight of the words pressing against his chest. Violet? His niece? They'd seen each other sporadically over the years at obligatory family gatherings, her presence a flash of color against the muted backdrop of his controlled world. A teenager now, she was, 15? They had never been close. What would he even say to her? More importantly, what would he do with her? He was an architect, not a parent. The days that followed blurred into a series of tightly controlled crises. Liam, true to form, approached them with the same methodical precision he applied to his work. There were calls to lawyers, papers to sign, and endless logistics to manage. His apartment, stark and functional, was hardly the place for a grieving teenager. He doubted she'd appreciate his color-coded pantry or the soft hiss of white noise that lulled him to sleep. Violet was an abstraction to him, a name attached to a chaotic disruption he wasn't prepared for. But there was no escaping the reality that she was coming, her life appended and tethered to his in a way neither of them had chosen. When Violet arrived, her presence filled his pristine apartment with a strange and unwelcome energy. She stood in the entryway, her suitcase scuffed and mismatched with the careful aesthetics of the space. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her shoulders hunched in a way that made her seem smaller than she was. Liam, standing stiffly across from her, tried to summon words of comfort, but they felt foreign on his tongue. Violet, he said, his voice clipped. Welcome. I hope this arrangement can work. She didn't respond, her gaze sweeping over the polished floors and spotless countertops. There was no warmth here, no trace of the life she'd left behind. The silence between them stretched awkwardly until Liam, desperate to fill it, gestured toward the hallway. Your room is down there. I cleared some space for you. Violet nodded, her expression unreadable, and dragged her suitcase past him. He watched her retreating figure, a wave of helplessness washing over him. How was he supposed to do this? She was grieving, a child thrust into a nightmare, and all he could think about was the way her bag's wheels had scuffed his floor. Over the next few days, Liam found himself in a state of constant unease. Violet's presence was a disruption he couldn't control. She left her shoes by the door, her jacket draped carelessly over a chair. She didn't adhere to his rigid meal schedules or his silent evenings, and her grief manifested in ways that made him uncomfortable. Sometimes she was silent, retreating into her room for hours, and other times she was loud, slamming doors or crying openly. Liam didn't know how to reach her, and truthfully, he wasn't sure he wanted to. His own grief lingered in the corners of his mind, unacknowledged and unwelcome. Margaret had been his only sibling, their relationship complicated but steady, like an old house that creaked but held firm. He hadn't been there for her enough, he knew that. Their lives had diverged, hers filled with laughter and family while his remained solitary and meticulously ordered. And now she was gone, leaving behind the daughter he barely knew and the guilt he couldn't escape. One evening, Liam found Violet in the living room, staring at a photograph she'd placed on the coffee table. It was of Margaret and Andrew, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness Liam couldn't comprehend. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or retreat. Before he could decide, Violet broke the silence. "They were happy," she said, her voice raw. "Even when things weren't perfect, they were happy." Liam nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "They were good people," he said awkwardly, the words feeling insufficient. Violet looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but piercing. "Why did it have to be them?" Her voice cracked, and Liam felt the weight of her pain, heavy and unrelenting. "I don't know," he admitted softly, the truth of it cutting through him. He wanted to fix things, to smooth out the jagged edges of her grief, but this was something even he couldn't control. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Liam realized how unprepared he truly was. His life had been a series of carefully constructed walls, each one designed to keep chaos at bay. But now the walls were crumbling, and he was left standing in the rubble with a grieving teenager he didn't know how to help. He didn't sleep that night, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. How could he give Violet what she needed when he didn't even know what that was? What if he failed her, adding another layer of pain to her already shattered world? The thought of failure gnawed at him, but so did the realization that he didn't have a choice. Margaret had trusted him with her daughter, and that trust was a responsibility he couldn't ignore. In the weeks to come, Liam knew his life would change in ways he couldn't yet predict. The routines he clung to, the order he valued so highly, would be tested and reshaped. And while the prospect terrified him, there was a small, unspoken part of him that wondered if, perhaps, the change might be what he needed, too. For now, though, he could only take it one step at a time, starting with the girl asleep down the hall and the fragile connection they both so desperately needed to build. Violet's suitcase sat by the foot of her bed, unopened. She couldn't bring herself to unpack, as if keeping her things inside might mean she didn't have to stay. The room Liam had prepared for her was pristine, a blank canvas devoid of warmth. The walls were a pale, featureless gray, the furniture sleek and functional. A single window let in the barest amount of light, filtered through perfectly aligned blinds. It was the kind of room you might expect to see in a magazine, untouched by human life. She ran her fingers along the edge of the bedspread, the fabric stiff beneath her hand. Everything in this house felt cold. Her parents' home had been messy and full of color, walls covered with photographs, corners crammed with her mother's books and her father's forgotten coffee cups. Here, there was no sign of life, no sense that anyone truly lived in this space. It was as if she had stepped into someone else's dream and found it sterile and uninviting. Liam, meanwhile, lingered outside the door, his fingers brushing against the doorframe. He wanted to say something, anything, to make her feel welcome, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't used to this. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people at arm's length, and now he was tasked with comforting a grieving teenager. He cleared his throat, hesitating before stepping inside. "I thought you might want some dinner," he said awkwardly, his voice too loud in the stillness of the room. "There's, pasta in the kitchen." Violet turned to him, her face blank. She didn't answer, didn't even nod, just stared at him until he shifted uncomfortably. When the silence stretched too long, he backed away, mumbling something about leaving her alone. Later that evening, Liam sat in his favorite chair in the living room, nursing a glass of water he didn't want. His apartment, usually a haven of peace, felt uncomfortably tense. He could hear Violet moving around her room, her footsteps hesitant. He had spent the past week obsessing over how to make her feel at home, but now that she was here, he realized he had no idea how to actually connect with her. Violet finally emerged, her movements sluggish. She slumped onto the couch, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the coffee table. Liam watched her out of the corner of his eye, unsure how to break the silence. "So," he began, the word hanging in the air like an unfinished sketch. "How's the room? Is there anything you need?" "It's fine," she said flatly, her tone making it clear she didn't want to talk. She crossed her arms, pulling her knees up to her chest. Liam nodded, fumbling for something else to say but coming up empty. The following days followed a similar rhythm. Violet was withdrawn, her once vivid personality dulled by grief. Liam caught glimpses of who she used to be in the small things, a stray doodle on a napkin, the way her fingers drummed against her leg in time with the music she listened to through her headphones. But these moments were fleeting, swallowed quickly by the heavy silence that hung between them. Violet didn't seem to care about the rules Liam had painstakingly put in place. She left her shoes in the middle of the hallway, her backpack slumped against the wall. Her sketches began to appear on the dining table, their edges curling from spills of water. Liam bit his tongue, trying not to snap, but it grated on him. His apartment was his sanctuary, his one place of control, and now it felt like it was slipping away from him. One evening, he finally lost his composure. Violet had left a trail of crumbs from the kitchen to the living room, and Liam, already on edge from a stressful day at work, couldn't hold back. "Violet," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "Would it kill you to clean up after yourself?" Violet looked up from her phone, her expression a mix of exhaustion and annoyance. "Would it kill you to stop being such a control freak?" she shot back, her voice rising. The words stung more than Liam wanted to admit. "I'm just asking for a little respect," he said tightly. "This is my home." "It doesn't feel like a home," she muttered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. But he did, and it stopped him cold. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Violet turned her attention back to her phone, and Liam walked away, his chest tight. He spent the rest of the night staring at his computer screen, pretending to work but replaying the argument in his head. She was right, in a way. This apartment wasn't a home, not for her. But he didn't know how to make it one. Violet, too, felt trapped. She hated this place, hated its perfection and its silence. It wasn't just the apartment, it was the way Liam acted, so stiff and formal, as if he were afraid to let her see anything real. She missed her parents desperately, missed the chaos of their home, the warmth and laughter that had filled every corner. Here, she felt like an intruder, a disruption in a life she hadn't chosen to be part of. She spent most of her days in her room, her headphones blaring music loud enough to drown out her thoughts. She tried to draw, but her sketches felt lifeless, the joy she once found in art buried under layers of sorrow. Her parents had always encouraged her creativity, filling their home with her paintings and sculptures. Liam barely glanced at her work, and she resented him for it. The days stretched into weeks, and the distance between them only grew. They passed each other like strangers, exchanging the bare minimum of words. Liam busied himself with work, retreating into the safety of his routines, while Violet built walls around herself, her grief a fortress he couldn't penetrate. But the tension was unsustainable, and they both knew it. Something had to give. For now, though, they remained locked in their separate worlds, neither willing, or able, to bridge the emotional chasm that had formed between them. Liam walked into the living room and froze. His once pristine coffee table was buried under an avalanche of art supplies. Tubes of paint rolled perilously close to the edge, sketchbooks lay sprawled open, and a half-finished watercolor piece was pinned under a mug, its contents dangerously close to spilling. He stared at the chaos, a knot of irritation tightening in his chest. "Violet," he called sharply, the edge in his voice cutting through the hum of her music. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, her headphones dangling around her neck, paint smudged on her fingers. "What?" she asked, her tone casual but her expression guarded. "What is this?" He gestured to the table. "I thought we agreed you'd keep your supplies in your room." "I needed more space," she replied, folding her arms. "You have all this room, and no one even uses it." Liam took a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. "That's not the point. This is a shared space. You can't just take over." "I'm not taking over," she shot back. "I'm just trying to live. Isn't that what you wanted when you took me in?" The words hit harder than he expected, but he refused to back down. This isn't about that. It's about respecting the space we both share. Maybe if this place didn't feel like a museum, I wouldn't need to make it livable, she said, her voice rising. The argument ended with Violet storming back to her room and slamming the door. Liam stared at the mess, unsure whether to clean it up or leave it as a symbol of his defeat. He opted for neither, retreating to his own room with a lingering sense of failure. Their days began to follow a pattern of tension. Violet's creativity was boundless, spilling into every corner of the apartment. She left traces of herself everywhere, paintbrushes in the bathroom, sketches taped to the fridge, even a set of brightly painted stones arranged on the windowsill. Liam found himself constantly cleaning up after her, his irritation mounting with each new discovery. To Violet, his irritation felt like rejection. She could see it in the way he frowned at her projects, the way he straightened things she'd left out. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it didn't matter what he thought. But as the days went on, his coldness began to wear on her. Every time he snapped at her for leaving a mess, she felt like an intruder, like she didn't belong. "You know, not everything has to be perfect," she said one evening, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she watched him meticulously fold the blanket she'd left on the couch. "I like order," he replied tersely, not looking at her. "You like control," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear. He straightened, his jaw tightening. "And you seem to enjoy chaos." "Maybe chaos is better than whatever this is," she said, gesturing around the room. "At least it feels alive." The argument escalated from there, neither willing to back down. By the end, Violet was in tears, and Liam was pacing his bedroom, his hands clenched into fists. He felt like a failure, not just as a guardian but as a person. He couldn't understand her, couldn't reach her. And worse, he wasn't sure he wanted to. For Violet, the arguments were exhausting. They left her feeling raw and unwanted, her grief compounded by Liam's inability to connect with her. She missed her parents so much it hurt, missed the way they had always encouraged her creativity, celebrated her quirks. Here, she felt stifled, like she was too much and not enough all at once. One afternoon, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She set up an easel in the corner of the living room and began painting, her strokes bold and unapologetic. Liam walked in halfway through, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Violet, what are you doing?" he asked, his tone exasperated. "Painting," she said without looking at him, her brush moving in quick, deliberate strokes. "In the living room?" "Why not?" she challenged, finally meeting his gaze. "It's not like you ever use this space." He opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He wanted to yell, to demand she take her things back to her room, but something in her expression gave him pause. She looked defiant, yes, but also sad, as if she were bracing herself for rejection. "Just clean up when you're done," he said finally, his voice resigned. Violet stared at him for a moment, surprised, before nodding. "Okay." It wasn't a truce, not really, but it was the closest they'd come to one. For the next few days, Liam tried to ignore the splashes of color that seemed to multiply in his once monochromatic apartment. He told himself it was temporary, that she'd eventually grow bored and move on. But the color stayed, and so did the tension between them. The smallest things became flashpoints for their arguments. A forgotten cup on the counter. A jacket draped over a chair. Each irritation piled onto the last, building a wall of resentment between them. Liam couldn't understand why Violet couldn't just follow his rules, and Violet couldn't understand why he cared so much about things that didn't matter. "I'm not a robot, Liam," she snapped one evening after he criticized her for leaving paint on the table. "I can't live like you do." "And I can't live like this," he shot back, gesturing to the mess. "Then maybe I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice breaking. Liam froze, the words hanging in the air between them. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that of course she should be here, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, He stood there in silence as she walked away, the sound of her door slamming echoing through the apartment. That night, as he sat alone in the living room, Liam felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He didn't know how to fix this, how to bridge the gap between them. All he knew was that something had to change, and soon, before they both crumbled under the strain. Liam was in the middle of a meeting when his phone vibrated insistently on the polished surface of the conference table. He glanced down, frowning at the unknown number. Ignoring it seemed like the responsible thing to do, but something gnawed at him, a prickling sense of unease. Apologizing to his colleagues, he stepped out into the hallway and answered. "This is Mr. Prescott," he said, his voice clipped. "Mr. Prescott, this is Principal Jacobs from Violet's school. I'm calling to discuss a concern about her attendance." Liam's heart sank. Attendance? She's been missing a significant number of classes over the past 2 weeks. We've tried reaching out to her directly, but, well, we felt it was time to involve you. Liam felt a flush of embarrassment, imagining the judgment in the principal's voice. "I wasn't aware," he admitted, the words tasting bitter. "I'll speak with her." He ended the call, the rest of the day a blur of half-hearted work and mounting frustration. By the time he got home, he was simmering, the tension rolling off him in waves. Violet was sitting on the couch, headphones on, sketchbook balanced on her lap. She looked up as he walked in, her expression neutral, but he could see the wariness in her eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She slid her headphones off, closing the sketchbook with deliberate slowness. "What now?" "I got a call from your school," he began, folding his arms. "Care to explain why you've been skipping classes?" Violet's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. "Why do you care?" she said, her voice laced with defiance. "It's not like you ever ask about school." "That's not the point," Liam snapped. "You can't just decide not to go. There are rules, Violet. Responsibilities." "I know all about your rules," she said, standing up. "And I know you only care about them when they make your life easier." "Don't make this about me," he shot back. "You're the one skipping school." "Because I can't stand it," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Do you know what it's like to sit in a room full of people pretending everything's normal? Nothing is normal." Her words hit him like a physical blow, but he couldn't back down. "So you just wander the city? Do you even understand how dangerous that is?" "I'm not wandering," she said, her tone icy. "I'm going to art galleries. At least there, I can breathe." Liam stared at her, caught off guard. "Art galleries?" "Yes, art galleries. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You don't understand anything about me." "That's not fair," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. "It's true," she said, her voice quieter now but no less sharp. "You don't want me here. You just want me to stay out of your way." "That's not," he stopped himself, struggling to find the right words. She wasn't entirely wrong. He had spent more time resenting her presence than trying to connect with her. But that didn't mean he didn't care. "I'm trying, Violet," he said finally, his voice softer. "But you make it so hard." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "You think this is easy for me? I lost everything, Liam. My parents, my home. And now I'm stuck here with someone who doesn't even like me." "I don't know what you want me to do," he admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I don't know how to help you." "I don't need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need you to stop making me feel like I don't belong." She turned and walked to her room, the door closing softly behind her. Liam stood in the living room, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he let himself admit that he had no idea what he was doing. He had thought rules and structure would be enough, but they weren't. Violet needed more from him, and he wasn't sure he was capable of giving it. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of her standing in front of him, defiant and hurting. He thought about the art galleries she mentioned, the one place she seemed to find solace. He didn't understand it, not fully, but maybe that was the problem. Maybe he needed to try. For her sake, and for his. Liam's phone buzzed on his desk, interrupting his meticulous review of blueprints for a new project. He glanced at the screen and saw the name Dr. Carlson. He sighed, his stomach tightening. He had agreed to send Violet to therapy after her school's guidance counselor suggested it, but he hadn't expected the therapist to contact him directly. "Mr. Prescott, thank you for taking the call," Dr. Carlson began. Her voice was calm, professional. "I wanted to discuss Violet's progress." Liam leaned back in his chair, already feeling defensive. "Is she doing all right?" he asked, his tone clipped. "She's been opening up about her grief," Dr. Carlson said. "But it's clear she's struggling to feel connected in her current environment. I think it would benefit her if you joined a few of her sessions." "Me?" Liam blinked, caught off guard. "I don't see how that would help. She's the one seeing you. Isn't this supposed to be about her?" "It is about her," the therapist said patiently. "But part of her healing involves feeling understood and supported by the people in her life. Joint sessions could help bridge some of the emotional distance between you." Liam's first instinct was to refuse. His schedule was already packed, and the idea of sitting in a therapist's office, exposing his inadequacies, made his skin crawl. "I don't think I have the time for that," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "My work is demanding." Dr. Carlson paused, then said, "I understand you have responsibilities, but I encourage you to reconsider. Violet needs to know she's not navigating this alone." "I'll think about it," Liam said quickly, eager to end the call. He hung up, pushing the conversation to the back of his mind as he returned to his work. But the words lingered, nagging at him in the quiet moments between meetings and deadlines. That evening, Violet sat at the kitchen table, drawing absent-mindedly on the edge of a notebook. Liam poured himself a glass of water, watching her from across the room. He knew he should say something, but the words felt too heavy, too awkward. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Your therapist called today." Violet looked up, her pencil hovering midair. "Okay." She suggested I join you for a session. He tried to sound casual, but his discomfort bled through. "And?" she asked, her expression unreadable. "I don't think it's necessary," he said, placing the glass down with a faint clink. "You're already seeing her. Isn't that enough?" Violet's face hardened. "Of course you think that." "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "It means you don't care," she said, her tone sharp. "You just want me out of the way so you can go back to your perfect little life." "That's not fair," Liam shot back. "I've done everything I can to make this work." "Have you?" she demanded, standing up. "Because it doesn't feel like it." Liam felt his patience snap. "I didn't ask for this, Violet. I'm doing the best I can, but I can't drop everything just because you're upset." Her eyes flashed with anger, but there was hurt behind it, too. "You're right. You didn't ask for this. Neither did I. But at least I'm trying. You're just pretending like none of this matters." Before he could respond, she stormed out of the room, leaving her sketchbook behind. Liam sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. He felt trapped, caught between his responsibilities and the gnawing guilt that he wasn't doing enough. The truth was, he missed the simplicity of his old life, the order and predictability. But admitting that felt like a betrayal. The arguments only grew more frequent. Violet grew more withdrawn, her frustration bubbling over in small, cutting remarks. Liam, in turn, became shorter with her, snapping at the smallest things. The tension between them was suffocating, the apartment feeling smaller and colder with each passing day. One night, after another argument left them both fuming, Liam sat alone in the living room, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. He felt like a failure. No matter how hard he tried to impose structure, to create a sense of normalcy, everything kept falling apart. He thought about Dr. Carlson's words, about Violet's accusation that he didn't care. He wanted to care. He wanted to be the kind of person who could fix this. But he didn't know how. In her room, Violet sat on the floor, clutching a photograph of her parents. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She felt so alone, so untethered. Every argument with Liam only deepened the ache in her chest. She wanted him to understand, to see how much she was hurting, but he seemed so distant, so unwilling to meet her halfway. The next morning, they passed each other in silence, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging heavy in the air. Liam wanted to say something, to break the cycle they'd fallen into, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, they went about their day, both feeling more isolated than ever. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft clatter of Liam's keyboard as he worked late into the evening. His focus was razor-sharp, his mind buried in the intricate details of a project deadline. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered the absence of Violet's usual movements, her music playing faintly through the walls, the shuffle of her footsteps, but he dismissed it. She was probably sulking in her room after their latest argument. Hours passed before Liam finally looked up, stretching his stiff shoulders. The clock on his desk read 11:15 p.m., and the apartment felt unnaturally still. A small pang of unease crept in as he walked to Violet's room, intending to check on her. He knocked lightly, then again, when there was no answer. "Violet," he called, his voice hesitant. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing an empty room. Her bed was untouched, the covers neatly in place. The art supplies scattered on her desk sat undisturbed, as if she hadn't been there in hours. His stomach dropped. He tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He texted her, his fingers typing faster than his thoughts could keep up. No response. For a moment, he stood frozen, clutching the phone like it might suddenly offer a solution. His rational mind kicked in, telling him not to panic. Maybe she'd gone for a walk, needed some air. Teenagers did impulsive things all the time. Still, he couldn't shake the growing knot of dread in his chest. He checked the front door, finding her jacket and shoes missing. A wave of anger rose to meet his fear. She hadn't even bothered to tell him where she was going. He paced the living room, wrestling with what to do next. A part of him wanted to call someone, to ask for help, but another part held him back. She's old enough to know better, he thought. She needs to learn there are consequences. But as the minutes turned into hours, his resolve wavered. He pictured her out there, alone in the dark, and the knot in his chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. He reached for his phone again, ready to call the police, when it buzzed in his hand. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was calm and clinical. "Mr. Prescott? This is St. Mary's Hospital. We have Violet here. She's been in a minor accident." The words hit him like a blow, and he barely managed to respond. What happened? Is she okay?" "She's stable," the nurse assured him. "She was brought in with some minor injuries after falling from her bike. She gave us your number." "I'm on my way," he said, grabbing his keys and rushing out the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur of adrenaline and self-recrimination. He replayed every argument, every cold moment, every time he'd chosen work over her. He told himself she was fine, that the nurse had said as much, but the fear gnawed at him anyway. By the time he arrived, his hands were trembling. In the emergency room, he spotted Violet sitting on a gurney, her arm wrapped in a bandage and a faint bruise blooming on her cheek. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening with surprise. "Liam," she said softly, her voice tinged with guilt. He stopped in front of her, his heart pounding. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Do you have any idea how worried I was?" She looked away, her shoulders slumping. I needed to get out. I didn't think you'd care." "Not care?" He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Violet, he stopped himself, taking a deep breath to steady his voice. "Of course I care. You're my responsibility." Her face twisted, a mix of anger and sadness. "That's all I am to you, isn't it? A responsibility. Something you have to deal with." The words cut deeper than he expected. He sat down beside her, his hands clasped tightly together. "You're more than that," he said quietly, his voice unsteady. "I'm just not good at showing it." She glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "You're not good at talking, period." Despite himself, Liam let out a shaky laugh. "Fair point." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sterile hum of the hospital filled the silence, but it wasn't as oppressive as the silences they'd shared before. This one felt like a truce, fragile but real. "I didn't mean to scare you," Violet said after a while. "I just felt stuck. Like I couldn't breathe." Liam nodded, his throat tight. "I should have noticed. I should have done more." "It's not just you," she admitted. "I've been pushing you away, too. It's easier than, feeling everything." "I know," he said softly. "But we can't keep doing this." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you mean that?" "Yes," he said, and for the first time, he truly meant it. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to do better. We'll figure this out together." Her lip quivered, but she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded, a small but hopeful gesture that felt like the first step forward. That night, as they drove home, the silence between them wasn't heavy or strained. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of unspoken understanding. Liam knew they had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like they might actually get there. Together. Liam sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at Violet as she dozed lightly on the gurney. Her face, usually guarded or defiant, was soft and unprotected in sleep. The fluorescent lighting made her pale skin look even more fragile, and he couldn't stop himself from cataloging every scrape and bruise. He had spent the past hour replaying the events of the night, each moment amplifying his guilt. She had been hurt, and he hadn't even known she was gone until it was too late. When Violet stirred, her eyes fluttering open, Liam straightened. He didn't know what to say, how to start. She blinked at him, her expression groggy and uncertain, before settling into a quiet wariness. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice scratchy. "Of course I'm still here," he replied, his throat tightening. "Where else would I be?" She shrugged lightly, avoiding his gaze. "Work, maybe." The words hit him square in the chest, not because they were harsh but because they carried a quiet truth he couldn't deny. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together tightly. "Violet, I need to say something," he began, his voice halting. "And I need you to hear me, even if I don't say it perfectly." She looked at him then, her tired eyes meeting his, and he felt his resolve falter under the weight of her sadness. But he pushed forward. "I've messed up," he admitted, his voice breaking. "From the moment you came into my life, I've been so focused on controlling everything, on keeping things tidy, predictable, that I forgot what actually matters. And that's you." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face, but she didn't interrupt. "I've been scared," he continued. "Scared of failing, of not being good enough to take care of you. I thought if I just stuck to what I knew, rules and structure, it would somehow work out. But it hasn't. And that's on me." She looked away, her fingers picking at the edge of the blanket. "I didn't make it easy," she said softly. No, he said quickly, shaking his head. This isn't about you. You've been grieving, Violet. You've been going through something I can't even imagine, and instead of supporting you, I made things harder. I shut you out because I didn't know how to let you in. Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept her composure, her voice trembling. I didn't think you wanted me here. I do, he said firmly, the words coming easier now. I want you here. I just didn't know how to show it. I didn't know how to be what you needed. The room fell quiet, the weight of his confession settling between them. Violet wiped at her face with the back of her hand, her expression unreadable. You hurt me, she said finally, her voice small but steady. Not on purpose, but you did. Liam nodded, the truth of her words cutting deep. I know. And I'm sorry. I can't undo what's happened, but I want to make it better. I want to try, if you'll let me. She studied him for a long moment, her defenses slowly lowering. You mean that? Yes, he said without hesitation. I mean it. Whatever it takes. Therapy, art galleries, talking more, whatever you need. I'm here for you. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she brushed it away quickly, her voice shaky. I want to believe you. I know I haven't given you much reason to, he said gently. But I'm asking you to give me another chance. Please. Violet nodded slowly, her voice a whisper. Okay. Relief flooded him, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She offered him a small, tentative smile. Don't mess it up. He laughed softly, a sound that carried more hope than humor. I'll do my best. The tension that had hung between them for so long seemed to loosen, replaced by something tentative but real. As they sat there, neither entirely sure what came next, it was clear that something had shifted. They weren't healed, not yet, but they were finally on the same path. And for now, that was enough. The therapy sessions were awkward at first. Liam sat stiffly in the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, while Violet slouched next to him, her expression unreadable. Dr. Carlson, patient and composed as ever, guided the conversations, encouraging them to speak openly. Liam often stumbled over his words, unsure how to articulate his emotions, while Violet hesitated, testing his sincerity. But week by week, the walls between them began to crack. Liam learned to listen without interrupting, to really hear Violet's feelings instead of trying to fix or dismiss them. She, in turn, began to open up about the ache of her grief, the loss of her parents, and the loneliness she felt even in their small victories. It wasn't easy, some sessions left them raw and drained, but the progress was undeniable. For the first time, they were learning how to exist together without stepping on each other's wounds. One afternoon after therapy, Violet wandered into Liam's office, where he was bent over a set of blueprints. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching a sketchpad to her chest. Hey, she said softly. Liam looked up, surprised but pleased. Hey. What's up? I was thinking, she fidgeted with the corner of her pad. You know how you're always saying you want me to be more organized? He raised an eyebrow, waiting. What if we, I don't know, make a space for my art? Like a real one. A studio. He leaned back in his chair, considering her words. A studio, he repeated thoughtfully. In the apartment? Yeah. I mean, you're good at designing spaces, right? And I could help. We could make it ours. Her suggestion hung in the air, both a challenge and an olive branch. Liam smiled, a warmth spreading through him. I think that's a great idea. Over the next few weeks, their project took shape. They cleared out the spare room, its sterile emptiness replaced by a vision of color and creativity. Liam sketched designs for storage, shelving, and lighting, while Violet filled the space with splashes of personality, her sketches, swatches of fabric, and jars of paint. They argued over details. She wanted a bright orange accent wall, while he pushed for something more muted, but their disagreements were playful, underpinned by a growing sense of camaraderie. One Saturday, they spent hours assembling furniture and hanging artwork. Violet teased Liam about his obsession with precision, laughing when he measured the same shelf 3 times before drilling. He retaliated by smudging her nose with a streak of paint, which turned into a full-blown color war. By the end of the day, they were covered in splotches of green and blue, laughing so hard their sides hurt. The studio became a haven for both of them. Liam found himself drawn to the space, sketching architectural designs alongside Violet as she painted or worked on her sculptures. Their shared love of creating things, of turning chaos into beauty, became a bridge between them. It was a language they both understood, one that didn't require words but spoke volumes. One evening, as they sat on the floor of the studio surrounded by their work, Liam glanced at Violet, who was carefully shading a charcoal sketch. "You're really good at this," he said, his tone admiring. She looked up, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Thanks." He hesitated, then said, "You know, I've been thinking about something." "What?" she asked, tilting her head. "About making this official," he said carefully. "About adopting you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. "You do that?" "Of course," he said, his voice steady. "You're already family. This would just make it real." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't try to hide them. "I'd like that," she said softly. The adoption process was both straightforward and profound. Signing the papers felt like a formal acknowledgement of what had already grown between them, a bond forged not by blood but by choice. Liam didn't feel the overwhelming sense of order he had once sought. Instead, he felt something messier but far more meaningful. When the day finally came, they celebrated quietly, ordering pizza and sitting in the living room, surrounded by the vibrant chaos of their home. It was far from perfect: paint-stained carpets, mismatched furniture, and shelves overflowing with books and art supplies, but it was theirs. And it felt alive. In the weeks that followed, Liam found himself smiling more often. Violet filled the apartment with her laughter, her energy, her art. He still occasionally grumbled about her leaving mugs on the counter or forgetting to turn off lights, but the frustration never lingered. They had learned how to bend for each other, how to let go of what didn't matter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood side by side in the studio, putting the final touches on their latest project. Violet had convinced Liam to build a large communal table, one they could both use for their creative pursuits. He had designed it, and she had painted it, the surface covered in intricate patterns of swirling colors. "Not bad for a team effort," she said, stepping back to admire their work. "Not bad at all," he agreed, his smile easy. They stood there for a moment, the room bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Violet turned to him, her voice light. "You know, for someone who's obsessed with order, you've gotten pretty good at embracing the mess." Liam laughed, ruffling her hair affectionately. "And for someone who thrives on chaos, you've taught me to appreciate a little color." She grinned, leaning against him. "I think we make a good team." "We do," he said, his voice full of certainty. As they cleaned up, their laughter filling the room, Liam realized just how far they had come. The apartment, once sterile and cold, was now a reflection of their journey, a space alive with creativity, warmth, and love. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was theirs, and that was enough.